Hi, we continue in Genesis 37 as Joseph's older brothers, who we already know hate him even more, are conspiring from a distance to kill him. So as we enter into our passage today in verses 19 to 25, I left up verse 18 so we can see what we've seen several times in this chapter, the narrator telling us in advance what's going to happen. So we saw last time in verse 18 they conspired to kill him, and then we see the description of their killing him. And we'll see it again in the second half of the passage we'll look at today, where we're told by the narrator, Reuben delivered him from their hands, and then we hear how he did that, although he only partially did it, which we'll see more next time. Before we jump into our story, let's look on the right side of the screen just for a moment some of the issues to consider in interpreting Genesis 37 to 50. If you haven't watched the introductory video to this unit, I really encourage you to do so, where we go over all these issues, and I won't go over them all now, including how the characters of Joseph and Pharaoh and Jacob and such are change as they go, but are also different from depending upon which scholars we look at and what they expect to see and what they find when they read the stories for the character of various people. But one thing I want to look at today is the question of sources and how the pieces fit together. I've been largely ignoring it, saying, I believe rightly, as many recent scholars have said, that we can read this coherently without wondering about any verses being from later authors or apart from it. And yet, our section today, which has a passage about Reuben and a passage about Judah, we're only going to look at the Reuben part now. You can see here in the key words that the Reuben part is here, and then the Judah part is down there, and then Reuben comes back. Is largely seen traditionally as two different versions of it, as you can see right here, the so-called Reuben Midianite version and the Judah Ishmaelite version. And all you're seeing on the right side of the screen is the text divided into these two pieces. But what that misses, as more astute scholars like Falkman have shown over against the largely source-oriented views of scholars until the 1980s, is that this ruins the structure of the chapter and the deliberate contrast between Reuben and Judah. Because as we've seen in the shape of the Joseph story, there are doubles and triplets all along. So as we look at the story here, we saw that Joseph has two dreams here, and then the baker and cupbearer have a pair of dreams, and Pharaoh has two dreams. But in addition to the pairs of dreams, there are pairs of stories. So we'll see how the Tamar and Judah story, far from being displaced here, fits perfectly both with chapter 37 around the theme of clothes and misleading people around clothes, but also fits with the next chapter 39 where the exact same question comes up. So there's a triplet about clothes there, a triplet about dreams in 37, 40, and 41. And we can see that not only with stories, but with individual words. And I hadn't shown this chart earlier, but it's good to look at it now, I think, while we're halfway through the chapter or more. So we see the doubling of the dreams, and I already noted the doubling in the infinitive absolute Hebrew form for emphasis back in verse 8, when the brothers respond to Joseph's dream with their interpretation. They hated him even more, as repeated twice as we saw. The pasturing the flock was 3 times. We saw Shechem 3 times. Shalom was repeated twice in verse 14. We'll see last time Dothan was repeated. And then we see throwing triple, delivered double, etc., etc. And so these can't all be questions of different sources, can they? And this isn't just chapter 37, because in chapter 38 and 9, as I was showing you, but we'll see that doubling is a feature, not a bug. It's not a matter of looking behind the final text and trying to just sort things out. It's a matter of what the authors, whenever they were writing, and I'm assuming it's roughly in the time of the Persian response after the exile in Babylon was over, or even later perhaps in the time of Ptolemaic Egypt and their control over Jerusalem and its environments, which would fit the Egyptian context. I don't think we need to choose between those, and I don't think we can, on principle, answer the question of whether it's one or the other. Maybe it's some of both. But in any event, from whichever context, there's this issue of doubling, not just repeating things for emphasis, like the 2 dreams, and like Joseph will try to explain, the very fact that Pharaoh has two dreams suggests it's from God. That's Joseph's principle, but we don't know that principle from anywhere else, and God certainly doesn't affirm that. But what it often suggests, as we'll see, is 2 different angles on events. Today we'll see the Reuben perspective, and then we'll see the Judah perspective. And not only fits with just individual characters, but with the question of this entire unit as the story of the family of Jacob, not just the Joseph story. And so it's fitting here that we'll see this, and we'll see it also after the initial 5 chapters when Joseph is firmly installed as the right-hand man to Pharaoh in Egypt, and his father sends some of his sons out there to get food, that it'll really be all about the family and the question of the family, ending with them settling in Egypt, which ought to be a bad image, and yet many scholars have found it to be a positive one. So we'll get there when we get there. So another element about the chapter, as we've been looking at, this is key words and shape, as we've been seeing. We saw earlier that dream as noun and verb was really dominating in the section about the dreams, but here it's about movement. And as I was saying last time, Joseph seems to be wandering around. Literally, he's described as wandering around, not knowing what he's doing. He's obviously looking for his brothers, but he seemed unbelievably naive. And I mean unbelievably literally, in that he told the first dream to his brothers and they hated him, and they basically said so out loud. But then he told a second dream. Why would he tell the second one after he already knows his older brothers hate him? But then when his father sends him 70 miles from Hebron to Shechem to go find them, isn't he a little bit concerned that that might not be safe? As Jacob might have been concerned in an earlier generation of being sent all the way to Paddan Aram to see his uncle Laban, but at least his parents prepared him for it in an indirect way of perhaps training him to deal with the kind of trickstery nature of someone like Laban. But Jacob is doing nothing to prepare Joseph for his hateful brothers, just sending him out there all by himself. And so we saw that last time, that he was out wandering in the field, and a man in the field, who we don't know who he is, inexplicably was hearing the brothers saying they were moving on to Dothan. So let's look at the map for a little bit and see, in a story with so much movement, the actual action is very static, but it presents relationships at a distance, and I'd suggest that's part of the key element here. So we saw Hebron down here, where we learned relatively belatedly that that's where the family was, and then Jacob had sent them all the way up here to Shepherd, which as a practical matter makes no sense whatsoever. And as I showed with Google Maps last time, this is very mountainous country. The journey back and forth would involve many thousands of feet of elevation up and down both ways. So that, as a literal matter, makes no sense. And why would they have left Shechem and gone on to Dothan? There's no sense of, well, it wasn't green enough, there wasn't enough food for the animals. Why would there be more there? None of this is explained. And what's even more mysterious, as you can see on the left side of the screen in verse 25, when they look up and see a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead, and they're over here, how in the world can they know where they're coming from? How in the world can they know what ethnicity they are? And that it says they know they're going to Egypt, which is way down below here, not even on this part of the map. And how could they possibly know all those things? So there's a lot of gaps in the story, both the gaps in terms of Joseph's non-response to all the abuse he's going to get, and gaps to elements of how the characters know various things, whether the man walking in the field or the brothers about the impending caravan. But we'll have to keep that all in mind as we go. So let's put the key words up here, and we'll jump into our story starting in verse 19, after the narrator has already told us they conspired to kill him. And so notice the narrator's omnipresence here, so he can be with them in their little circle, wherever they are out in this field somewhere in Dothan. And they said to one another, literally man to his brothers, and their opposition to Joseph generates solidarity among them for now. And yet, as we'll find out in verse 21, Reuben is not there, and we don't know where else he could be, because as far as we know, they're out in a field, there's nowhere to go. And yet twice in verse 21, and then we'll see next time in verse 29, he appears to be separate from them physically, not just ideologically in terms of what to do with their younger brother here. So right now, they appear to be all together. They said to one another, here comes this dreamer. Another hine, which, as I've been noting throughout, is always left out of NRSV. Here we can see it right here as behold. Here comes this dreamer. And literally dream master, Hakalomoth here, Baal Hakalomoth, the master of the dreams, a sarcastic comment for sure. And it highlights, though, that that's what they see in him. They see him as someone who's dreaming to have dominion over them and to reign over them. Even though, as I noted in the video, as we've seen from people like Grossman and Pearson, their interpretation might not be accurate, as we'll see as the story continues to unfold. Because the first dream about grain doesn't respond simply to the question of reigning. It responds to how important grain is going to be when they are out of it and need to go to Egypt to get some. But we'll find that out later. So Moving on here, as Turner notes below, 3 different courses of action are suggested in quick succession. Immediate death for Joseph, which we see right here, delayed death in Reuben's voice, and then being sold into slavery. This presents a picture of brothers who opportunistically seek to take advantage of the situation rather than of a well-thought-out plot coming to fruition. But in any event, they're planning to kill him or get rid of him, their own brother. We've seen that all the way back to Cain and Abel, of course, and that's a pattern throughout. And we didn't see Jacob kill Esau, but we certainly saw him ruthlessly trick him out of his birthright, and then a little less ruthlessly out of the blessing. And so we've seen this pattern throughout here. So come now, and it is come now. I've been noting a number of the introductory words that NORSV provides, like right here, is not in the Hebrew. But come now is v'ata halak, only 2 other places in Genesis. Let us kill him. They're not putting that in euphemistic form here. They're naming it quite explicitly, and we'll see it again in verse 26, and certainly echoing Cain and Abel there. Narratively, the last time we heard kill was in the slaughter of the Shechemites in chapter 34, and we ought to be remembering that because that was 2 of Joseph's brothers there doing that. As Miguel de la Torre notes, speaking from a Latin American liberation theology perspective, dreams are dangerous, and those who dream must be killed, for they point to a reality that does not yet exist. And he may or may not have been thinking there of Martin Luther King, who had a dream and died, but he may well have been. And we know that dreams often suggest an unknown future, an imaginative alternative future, and the status quo usually does not like that for one reason or another. But here it is. So let us kill him and throw him in one of the pits. It doesn't say how they would propose to kill him in the first instance. Somehow they would kill him and throw his dead body into the pits. And the violence of language we're going to see a number of times here. The throwing is going to be repeated a few times, although Reuben will try to keep that down. We see it 3 times in this passage today of throwing. And we also saw that Ishmael is thrown by Hagar behind a bush. And we see the Hebrew babies thrown in Exodus 1. So all vulnerable children here. Joseph is not a baby, he's 17, but he's obviously the youngest of all the brothers there. And the one little thing that's hanging out unknown is Benjamin is his even younger brother, but he's not mentioned here at all. As my note down below further notes from the Talmud, the verb implies a depth of at least 20 cubits, a cubit being the distance from your fingertip to your elbow, hence out of sight. In the fullest sense, he is forgotten by the world, although it hasn't happened yet. This is just the proposal. Into one of the pits, El Habor here, or well, as Sarna notes below, these would be cisterns hewn out of rock intended for gathering and storing water in the rainy season. Dried out cisterns were occasionally used as temporary places of detention. It's hard to know how he knows that, although it makes a certain sense, although how many times would you need to be out in the field and need to put someone in a pit to detain them? I wonder how much violence is going on that the pits are a temporary jail for. But in any event, that's what they do, and you can see an image, as we saw in the cover picture last time, of a well out in the field. And so they propose that, and then we shall say, plainly meaning to say to their father, although they don't say that out loud, that a wild animal has devoured him. And wild animal is the normal translation, but it's really a haya ra'a, an evil animal, or at least a predatory animal, as my note below has. And I showed a video or 2 ago a chart of all the uses of the Hebrew ra and ra'a, 2 words for evil that are used in Genesis and beyond, and how it has word plays on roe for shepherd, as well as other things we'll see. So this could certainly suggest an evil animal, and as we'll see, as people like Falkman note, they become the very evil animal that devours him that they're imagining they will tell their father here. And this is what frames the chiasm, as Falkman notes, this idea of the evil animal devouring him. So let's take a look at this picture where he presents it from 18, as you can see, through 33, to match what they propose here and what they tell. And notice how that runs completely against the sense of having 2 different views here that were sometime by their sides. The chiasm fits it all together perfectly. And so, as modern Jewish commentators have said, the source-oriented view is basically a refusal to read. It's a refusal to read the text as we have it, and to imagine the text as something we don't have, and to deny the unity that tells the story that we have. So I'm just not going there. And Falkman's view provides a clear image of how the whole unit fits together without having to imagine breaks between it. So they will tell that an evil animal has eaten him, and we will see what will become of his dreams. And that's part of the wordplay there. We shall see Venera. So that's another wordplay on Ra'ah. And that we shall see ironically fulfilled later what becomes of his dreams when they bow down before him, as he predicted in his first dream. And now suddenly something strange happens. And my note below has simply the chiasm of these two verses. It's pretty easy to see. It repeats the phrase of rescuing from their hands, and it has not take his life and shed no blood. So a little A chiasm there. But what's strange here, in a chapter that has so many strange things about location and motivation, when Reuben heard it, well, where was he? We were told that all the brothers were conspiring together, and the they is just a they with no exceptions. And doesn't, as I was noting, no other place for him to be. And yet it's suggesting that he hears of it from some other context. So with Reuben introduced, let's look at Reuben in Genesis just for a minute and see what we know. And I've color-coded this by three categories. The green ones are the early ones associated with Leah. The pink ones are associated with Jacob. And the blue ones are associated with the brothers. So we saw his naming, a play on looked on my affliction there. And then we see that he helped his mother by finding mandrake. So he was a dutiful son to his mother Leah. And yet, inexplicably, near the very end of the story, just before we get to the story of Esau's family, we hear, while Israel lived in that land, Reuben went and lay with Bilhah, his father's concubine, much like Absalom would lie with David, his father David's concubine, one of the many parallels between the Joseph story and the David story. But in the Absalom story, it's plainly the purpose is for Absalom to show publicly that he's seeking to usurp his father's power and try to be king, and he engages in a full-scale rebellion against his father. But we have no evidence of Reuben engaging in any kind of rebellion against his father. In fact, before the scene that we'll look at tomorrow is over, he'll be crying and tearing his clothes for fear that he'll have to go to his father and be responsible for the death of Joseph. And he's very concerned with what his father thinks. So far from usurping his father, he's going to be subservient to his father. And yet, this is reported, and Israel heard of it and didn't seem to do anything about it, much like they heard of the rape of Dinah in chapter 34, and much like he kept the matter in mind about Joseph's dreams here. So a very passive father for these people. And so the blue parts are the parts we're looking at now, and both this immediate part here and the echoes of it in 42, which are very specific echoes, including of the word yeled, Hebrew for boy here and boy here. And then his very bizarre response to his father around the question of Benjamin going along. You may kill my two sons if I don't bring him back to you. Why in the world Reuben could imagine that his father would be happy that if he lost both Joseph and Benjamin, that killing two of his grandsons would somehow bring him comfort. So by that time, we can see that Reuben is not thinking clearly. And yet at the end, when old Jacob offers blessings and curses, if you will, upon all his children, he remembers what we noted up here he'd heard of but didn't do much about it, is sleeping with his concubine, and therefore says that's the final element that will mean that he will no longer excel because that happened. Just before that, in chapter 48, was Jacob adopting Ephraim and Manasseh, Joseph's two sons, but curiously comparing that to Reuben and Simeon, and we'll have to look more closely at that there. So far about Reuben, we don't know much about except for the mandrakes, but we'll see Reuben is a character of mixed characterization, as we'll see if we continue. So he heard it from wherever he was, and as the narrator tells us in advance, he delivered him or rescued him out of their hands. Recalling Jacob's rescue from his brother back in chapter 32. Reuben, in fact, of course, doesn't deliver him, as we'll see. Out of their hands, a key word here. So hands is 3 times in these 2 verses here, and you can see that hand here. Often they're covered over by the translation, but you can see them there. And that contrasts with what Aviva Gottlieb Zornberg was noting last time about seeing from a distance, and she suggested they desire to kill him by remote control, so to speak. So Reuben's trying to deliver them from their hands. And what he says, let us not take his life. putting himself with them. I'll just note in terms of words, the word for life is nephesh, which is sometimes wrongly translated as soul. There is no concept of soul in the Hebrew Bible, and nephesh is your essence, your life. And plainly it's just the life that in the sense of makes him alive, not something spiritual apart from his physical life here. So let's not take his life there on nephesh I was noting, and we'll see it in 42, recalling this. And yet Reuben responds, and as Pearson notes below, the rather authoritative way in which Reuben expresses himself, he uses imperative forms which denotes a distance between him and his brothers. At least he's trying to create that, but again, we don't know where he was, and we don't know where he's going to go when the scene that unfolds happens, and he comes back from somewhere else and discovers that Joseph is gone. So he says, first he said, let us not take his life, and then he says, shed no blood. Is that necessary after not take his life, as if they would shed some blood short of his life? Or is it meant to bring the word dam in there as a wordplay? The shed no blood only earlier was in the aftermath of the flood story, as you can see in my note below from Genesis 9. As Wenham notes, the use of all as a preposition rather than lo here is less binding. Don't shed his blood for the moment, just dump him in a pit. His interpretation of that. The only other use of blood previously was Cain and Abel, but we'll see it later in the story and the recollection of it later on. So there is no blood yet, but throw him into this pit. So that's the second time we're hearing about, they say throw him in the pit. He affirms that. Here, this one in the wilderness, like there's a pit right in front of them. And it's highlighting the wilderness. Midbar as wilderness doesn't necessarily mean, as it does here in the Pacific Northwest, trees and things apart from people, nor as it might mean other places, desert. It simply means the unpopulated place, and that's where they would be with their flock anyway. So the idea being they're far from anybody who would find them. But lay no hand on him, repeating that again and being part of the chiasm as well. And the narrator repeats it again, that he might rescue him out of their hand and restore him to his father, which is added here to the first part of it, highlighting that, at least from the narrator's perspective, that Reuben's desire is not just to save Joseph for his own sake, but to please his father. But so when Joseph came to his brothers, and he'd seen them from a distance, they saw him from a distance, and again, coming completely naive with no response at all, no sense of screaming, no sense of struggle, no sense of what are you doing? He's just completely silent. One could say like a sheep led to slaughter here, except he's not quite being slaughtered. Notice that the brothers here suggest they're all implicated. We have no reason to think that Reuben is separate at this point. We won't find that out till a little later. They stripped him of his robe. So it is the combination of the dreams, the Lord being Lord of the dreams, and the favoritism of dad that comes out here. As Gottlieb Zornberg notes again, the word psht here, hard to pronounce without the vowels, in modern Hebrew meaning is abstraction. And she says, quote, in order to analyze a subject, one must, in a sense, kill it, which is they denied of its specificity and turned it into something that's a principle. And that's what's happening here. He's a dreamer, he's a favored son, but he's no longer Joseph, their brother, and they don't call him their brother. Stripped of his kutenet here, the famous robe, not multicolored, but long-sleeved, as we hear the narrator specify. And they took him, again, notice the repetitions of here. Let us not take his life, but let us take him, as we saw earlier, and threw him into the pit, there for the third time. And then we learn as an afterthought, which would take away some of the dire element of it, the pit was empty. Because if it had been full of water, he would have been drowned, and that would have been that. Rashi interprets this as implying it's full of snakes and scorpions if it's empty of water, and may well have been. But that's why the emphasis on there was no water in it. So to suggest otherwise is a repetition. We don't need to hear both, that it was empty and there was no water, except to say maybe there were snakes and scorpions, but at least there was no water. And let's get to our final verse for today, even though I know we're going a little long, but there's a lot to be looking at. And what I really want to focus here is all the incredible detail, some of which we probably don't need. But could the brothers know any of this, seeing from a distance? And the horrific scene in which it takes place. There they are with their little brother in the pit. He must be screaming or something, but we don't hear it. And they sat down to eat. Yeah, and all of this will come back to haunt them. Their eating in Egypt will come back to haunt them. The bread issue will come back to haunt them. And as we'll see next time, the silver for which Joseph is sold will come back to haunt them. And here we hear about eating bread, lechem, and we'll see 15 of 24 times of lechem in Genesis are in the Joseph story. So looking up, or literally they lifted up their eyes and looked, and behold, they saw a caravan. And you can imagine they could see the caravan, or a chat here, only here in Genesis. But how do they know they're Ishmaelites? And we'll see them recalled at chapter 39, which is one of the elements that leads some scholars to suggest chapter 38 was an addition, but we don't need to go there, and we'll explore the issues when we get there. How could they tell what identity they are? And what do we know about Ishmaelites? Ishmael, of course, is the older brother of Isaac, and we were told a genealogy of him. But they see these people as family? They are family, but that doesn't seem to be the issue at all. But what would make them recognizable as different from Midianites? There's no evidence that clothing or any particular customs that are visible would suggest that they're different and identifiable, and scholars have provided nothing. But not only that, they see them coming from Gilead. And as I was noting in the map, if they're in Dothan here and Gilead is here across the Jordan, not only is that a long distance, I guess you could say if they're coming from across the Jordan, Gilead is just to say they're coming from the east. But how do they know what's in their camels? And we see carrying gum, balm, and resin. And why we need to know that now is setting up a surprise, because that's what we'll see again in 43 that Jacob says to send back with the brothers to the man in Egypt. So even though they don't have bread, they seem to have those trading elements. And so the brothers can't really see this, but the narrator suggests that they can look up and see that all the details of what they're carrying. Gum, balm, and resin, or laudanum in Greek and Aromaticum, on their way to carry it down to Egypt. And again, how would they know that? And I would like to suggest that what the narrator is doing is not telling us something literally about what the brothers could see, but telling us as readers the direction the story is going on the way down to Egypt. So at the moment Joseph's in the pit, they're sitting down to eat, and here comes the caravan of Ishmaelites. We'll have to wait till next time to see what happens then. See you next time. Bye-bye.